So Sarah Bachelard, she talks about traditional religious language having, in her words, gone dead. How true do you think that is?
I think it's true to a certain extent, because I think there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction that happens when we start to see that our churches are slowly emptying out and people are just not getting involved in the Anglican Church anymore. And I think what we start to do is we panic and we go, okay, well, we need to be more entertaining, we need to have like more modern music, and we need to have lights and things like that. That will draw people in. And I don't think that's actually what stopped people going. You know, for me, liturgy and, you know, traditional kinds of music, they're still very much alive.
Yeah.
I think really what has gone dead is the voice of the church that speaks into the world. And talking about language, there's nothing that really, there's no kind of one language that fits all, but one thing that I would say is around about in the 1950s, the Anglican Church stopped using the principles of natural law as one of their main driving points and moved over to using scripture, heavily influenced by America at that point, what was going on with the movements in America.
What do you mean by natural law here?
Natural law, I would say, so we see a sunset. We recognise it to be beautiful and magnificent and holy, and therefore we recognise it as God. And I think in natural law, in creation law, really, we can see God's work and we can really hear God's voice in a way that other languages may exclude people.
I see, and if I understand you right, then you're saying that God has increasingly been seen to be speaking only through Scripture and not through the wider creation.
Exactly,
Okay.
and Scripture in a way without any real recognition of context and culture and the Jewish tradition that it came from. And so the weaponising of Scripture has been used to exclude people. And I think it's really the language of the church speaking into the world that is dead, you know, but has gone dead.
We are stuck with a problem, though, aren't we? There are certain words we use in church, within these four walls, that are fundamental to us. Sin, redemption, salvation, even grace. Outside these four walls, they may mean nothing, or they may mean something that people are deeply inimical to people.
I think they become very loaded words if you don't really take in culture and context and tradition into how that language has grown up.
Right.
If you are really using Scripture in a way that is about judgment, not about justice, then I think it can become incredibly problematic, and it's a massive turn-off for people.
So how do we communicate? This is a really big question. How do we communicate, or how do we begin to communicate the truth of the gospel, which we firmly believe? How do we do that without recourse to these words, which unfortunately have become counterproductive outside of the church walls?
Yeah, I went into a church building not that long ago, and there was this wonderful sort of sign that you see in churches that was on the notice board, and it said, "The first aid box can be found in the south of the nave under the church warden's seat." And I really thought to myself, if I had a bleeding hand, I'd never walked into a church before and I didn't have a compass, I'd be completely stuffed. Do you know what I mean? So I think we have to recognise how language does exclude people. But it's not that liturgy is dead. You know, liturgy is alive. You know, the language of worship that many of us use in our churches is a living thing as far as I'm concerned. But if we're using Scripture to essentially exclude people, you know, if you look at the 1950s, you know, the church was really at the forefront of social justice, really speaking into issues of LGBTQ, of women's rights, of...
even in the 50s?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there was some really good work going on. And then as the emphasis changed, you know, and we became very large swathes of the Church of England became very biblical, we see people becoming progressively more and more uncomfortable with terminology.
Yeah. I wonder if, in fact, and there's an interesting part in the book where I think she quotes Rowan Williams saying that it's perfectly possible to express concepts that are vital to our faith in ways that are not constrained by traditional religious language. And in fact, if we confuse God with traditional religious language, then actually what we're doing is we're containing God within that language.
I think you see people in the secular world really trying to express that stuff, through this kind of ever-growing movement of well-being, and I think that industry, which is kind of rocketed, has come out of the church's inability to be able to communicate those messages.
Very interesting. Yeah. I'm reminded of Francis Bufford's wonderful book about, unapologetic. I don't know if you've read it. It's a brilliant book. But he has a wonderful riff about the word sin.
Yeah.
When he said the problem with sin is that it's either used in a way that is entirely condemning of people, or it's become a frivolous word, describing something that's naughty but nice, like chocolate or cream cakes.
Sinful,
And he said, look, sin, as properly understood by the church, really is the human propensity to mess things up. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, as soon as you express it in those terms, suddenly it becomes something you can get your hands on, and that's true.
I think so. Something Anders said, I think a couple of weeks ago, that he said that he found great comfort in the idea of the sort of final judgment, the last judgment day. And I thought that was so interesting because I've never seen it as a kind of comforting idea. But one thing I do find really comforting is this idea that we're not really in a place where we are being what we were made to be by God, which is to be the true reflection of God. And therefore, to feel a little uncomfortable in your skin, to feel like things are not quite right, is actually the right way to feel.
Yes. And your point about Anders is a really interesting one, because actually that comfort in judgment, of course, comes from exactly the point that Sarah Bachelard is making, which is that the resurrection shows us a truth about God, which is that his justice is a reconciling justice. His judgment is a reconciling judgment and not a condemning one.
Yes.
And I wonder if that isn't the key to our getting the language right in a way that makes what we're talking about relevant and appealing and important.
Yeah, I mean, it's that thing that John V. Taylor was saying. I know you're a fan of his work as well, where he said, imagine that the church exists to be the epicenter of healing, and healing and reconciliation, the healing of all things. And if that was our main emphasis, what would the church look like? I mean, it would be a very different place.
And how would it speak?
Exactly. And this idea, I think that Sarah Bachelard, she talks about, and she mentioned in the interview that you did with her, which I thought was she was so right, it really hit me in the heart, is that we're just not as rooted as we think we are as Christians.
No. I think that's absolutely right, and there's that wonderful quote of John Mayne's that she comes up with, which is, I think it's something like, the church can only communicate what it is.
Exactly.
And if it's being judgmental or superficial, it will communicate being judgmental and superficial.
Yes, it can only proclaim what it is.
Absolutely. If it lives grace, then it will communicate grace.
Exactly. And I think I was thinking so much about this idea of the post-resurrection world and the kind of space that we find ourselves in now. And one of the things that I've reflected on a lot over this course of this Lent group is this idea that I really feel like unless we can truly let go of the idea that in some way we control salvation, we won't be able to move forwards. In some way that our good deeds, our charitable deeds, win God's favour and win God's blessing. which of course that's not what was going on across at all.
No, yeah, absolutely, and it's nothing about grace.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly.
Emily, thanks very much.
You're welcome.